had me at Cello, Cello. You had me at Cello. You had me at Cello. Oh, you had me at Cello. Hi, everybody. Look at the time. It's 5 o'clock on a Friday, and you know what that means. It's time for another episode of Cello Chat. This week, my guest is Daniel Hopemark. Very excited to have you with us today and ask you a number of questions. But to begin with, how are you doing, Daniel?
I'm doing good. It's an exciting time in my life. I just welcomed my first child 2 weeks ago.
Congratulations, that's
Thank you
wonderful.
so much. So it's entering a whole new phase of life, and it's exciting to be here in this moment of it with you. So thanks for having me.
All right, well, thank you. So your background, how did you get started? Always interesting to hear how people got started in cello in the first place, and then the trajectory that took you to where you are today.
Yeah, I grew up in Chicago in Rogers Park, in a family of musicians. My dad is a cellist and a music educator. My mom's grandfather was a high school orchestra conductor for many years. And so growing up, it was maybe an expectation from my parents that I would be studying music. The rule in our household was I had to take lessons until I graduated high school, and then I could quit. So that kept me on the road of practicing to some extent, but certainly taking lessons. For a while in high school, I studied with my father. It was a little bit more of a casual relationship, and then I went off to undergraduate. I went to Carleton College,
Mhm.
and my parents tell this story. We were visiting schools, and they were like, "Oh, do you want to check out? You want to meet the orchestra teacher or see what they have?" And I was like, "No, I'm sure they have an orchestra. I'll play. Don't worry about it." And so they said, all right." So I went to college, and once I got there, I had a little bit more space to find my own relationship with music. And at Carleton College, I didn't have to declare a major until I was a sophomore. So by the end of my sophomore year, I was really thinking that music was a home for me. And at first, I was thinking about music ethnography and kind of studying how music fits into society. But I got scholarship to music camp that summer of my sophomore year, and that's when things clicked for me. For whatever reason, I challenged myself to play 8 hours a day, and I did it, and I got a lot better very quickly. And the teachers at the camp were like, "Wow, you can, if you choose this path, there is still a path for you as a performing musician."
So you
And I
say,
said,
sorry, you say for
"Yeah,
whatever reason, you don't know what that reason was.
no,
Huh.
I don't really. My younger brother is a violinist, and he had been to this camp many times. He was already kind of on this road to a performing to be a performing musician, and so maybe there was some element of competition in me. Maybe it was just being one of the things I love about summer camps, about music camps, is it kind of took me away from just everything else and just immersed me in this environment of music all the time. Inside, in my head, around me, other people also really pursuing it in this very active way. And I think it was some combination of those things. Um, and maybe coming at it through some more independence of having found myself a little bit more just as a person outside of as a cellist or as a musician, for my first couple years in college, that allowed me to say, "Hey, this is an exciting challenge. Let me see how I can apply myself in this new way." So that was a pretty transformational summer for me, and sent me on this new path. And at Carleton College, it's just a liberal arts school. It doesn't have a Bachelor of Music degree; it just offered a Bachelor of Arts in music, and so it created a pretty small pool for me as someone who was thinking about becoming a professional musician. And that meant that by my senior year, I was playing in other students' projects basically once a week, and just like in the heart of the musical environment at this small school. And that was a really exciting place for me to be. And so after I graduated, I went back home to Chicago because I wanted to apply to master's programs, but I was a little behind because I had chosen this path a little later than some. And so I lived at home with my parents. I studied with a wonderful master teacher in Chicago named Tanya Carey. And at the same time, I began my Suzuki teacher training with Dr. Carey. And my dad was already a Suzuki teacher. He decided to retake the beginning classes with me. And so we would go to class together, and he would share some of his ideas from years of trying to apply those. I was learning them for the first time. I had taken on a few students so I could experiment with them. And then I had my private lessons with Tanya Carey, where I was also kind of applying those same ideas of the basic fundamental building blocks of cello for myself at a concerto level. And so it was this wonderful overlapping of supports, right? Of learning how to teach the beginning steps for the first time, and then talking with my dad about kind of the nuances of how do you make this connection with a student, and then having my own students and failing quite often, and trying different things each week, and then trying to teach myself in my practicing. Okay, I'm trying to learn. I was working on the Rococo variations at the time. I'm trying to learn this challenging repertoire. How do I implement those fundamental building blocks to support myself? So that was a crucial year in my cello learning, and the beginning of the forming of my patchwork, my quilt, so to say, of what is now my professional career. This combination of self-reflection, of working on my own playing, of thinking of how do I become a professional at this instrument, and of teaching, and noticing how all of those elements can interact and fulfill me together. So I know it may be a longer, more detailed story, but I hope there's little nuggets along the way to meet whoever's listening on this Friday. So I applied to different master's programs and was accepted to the Boston Conservatory. And I studied there with Andy Mark. And I remember my trial lesson with him. And he had this wonderful, insightful way of sorting through all the various issues that were going on in my playing and finding what felt like a kind of a bedrock. Say, here is something that you can do well, and here's one more piece to layer onto it. And when we added that new piece, it had all this ripple effect in all various ways. Not just, here in this one little passage, we're going to do it a little differently, but here's this fundamental idea, and now we can use that idea to build off of it. And it helps in this measure, but it also helps my playing advance to the next step. And I really appreciated that kind of insight. There's Tanya Carey did it, and Andy Mark did it, and my teacher at Kentucky, Benjamin Karp, was also able to do that. And it always felt to me kind of like magic, like this insight that a teacher was able to have to reveal more about my playing than I was aware of myself. So we'll return to that magic, because that was also a motivational thing that has stayed with me. So my time in Boston was very striking because I was coming from a very small pool in my undergraduate, where I was kind of the cellist on campus, to an incredibly rich musical world in the city of Boston, where I was walking down the street, I would see 5 cellists by the time I got to the next block, which was really exciting and also kind of daunting, because I didn't quite, how do I say this? it was less clear to me that there was a place as a performing musician. Some of it was maybe a little bit of imposter syndrome, looking around at these cellists who've been really working hard at this professional track for years. And I was doing it for a couple years, and feeling some self-doubt, even though, of course, I had been accepted in the program and was, finding other musicians who I was really connecting with. But it forced me to think beyond, I'm going to work hard, I'll do an audition and I'll get an orchestra job, or I'll work hard and I'll be a concerto concert cellist. That was never really in my conscious imagination, but I think that in a lot of our training, that's often how we picture ourselves. And that was true for me, at least. Kind of unconsciously projecting myself into, I'm going to be touring around the world. And of course, so being in Boston and seeing the incredible cellists around me maybe gave me a little bit more of a reality check to say, all right, where is the space and where am I going to feel most fulfilled as a performer, and where am I going to be able to express myself? And so I started to incorporate some of my Suzuki training, which I had started the summer before, and I had continued each summer studying another couple books with Tanya Carey over the summer, and thinking, okay, how do I incorporate the Suzuki perspective of really being able to break things down and making music more accessible for people with the very high level of refinement and expectations that I was getting from Boston Conservatory. And so that led me to a couple projects. It led me, one, to continue to teach privately and expand my studio. It led me to write a little book I called the little vibrato book, which was just a step-by-step breaking down of how do we learn vibrato and what are the exercises that we can do to support each stage of that learning. And it led me to explore something that I call cello story time. Benjamin, you mentioned seeing some of those videos that I had put together. So while I was in Boston, I put together kind of an hour-long program of stories that I invented to go along with pieces that I could play on my cello. And then I performed them for a couple of different school groups. I went to a school, I went to the Boston Children's Museum, and it was a really exciting way for me to combine a new element of creativity in story writing with the maybe more abstract idea of music telling a story, so that I can make that storytelling and that connection with the audience more real, give more people access to it. And that was also really fun for me.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, right. It felt like this element that I didn't see as many people doing.
Yep.
So it felt like it was a broadening of what is possible with my instrument. I was also doing this mental gymnastics to say, okay, what are my goals with the cello? And I would tell myself, well, I want to earn a living with my instrument. And phrasing it that way, I felt like opened many more doors for me, because I saw all sorts of different ways of earning a living with my instrument. It could, like playing these stories, or teaching, or performing, right, or some combination of all of those things. So that was really on my mind. How do I earn a living with my instrument? I was ending my 2 years of my master's degree and looking around, not sure what I was going to do. And one of my colleagues from Boston Conservatory had gone to the University of Kentucky, where there was a graduate string quartet, a string assistant position. And he let me know that there was going to be a cello opening with a fully paid and stipended position. And I applied and I got it. And I thought, okay, here's an opportunity on a limited time scale for me to continue to practice and refine my skills, and also to support myself with my instrument. One of my goals. Okay, so I went to the University of Kentucky. I was very grateful and glad to get to study with Benjamin Karp there, and get this really rich string quartet assistantship experience, where again I was in a smaller musical community there in Kentucky, and so really able to make space for myself. I did a couple of I did a meditation and cello concert. Some of my graduate recitals were again trying to broaden what the role of cello in performance is. One of them was I called it a cello masquerade recital. I played pieces that were originally composed for other instruments, but arranged for the cello, and then I had everyone do a little arts and crafts and make their own masquerade masks. So it's like this combination, right, of classical music, which is really important to me and I really love, with other creative endeavors to broaden what it means to be a cellist or a performing musician, and have a little fun along the way. So I had 3 years in Kentucky, and it was again this deepening of my private teaching. I was continuing to study with Tanya Carey during the summers and do more training in the Suzuki method, with a refinement of my cello playing and trying to reach higher levels of artistry with my playing and performing. And after 3 years, I got my doctorate. I kind of took the seed of my little vibrato book and did my thesis on intonation. It was called the Search for Consistent Intonation. And again, it tried to take this skill that all of us cellists are working with on a daily basis, and destigmatize it, to say, we're all working on intonation. It's not a scary boogeyman. Oh, you have bad intonation. Oh, shame. Which is certainly something I felt. And try to also demystify it, to not say, oh, intonation is something that I have some days and I don't have other days, but to say there are distinct skills that we need to play in tune. And when we're not playing in tune, it's not just the intonation as a whole that is at fault, but we can do a little more investigating to say, well, which of these skills is preventing me from playing in tune? And that really helped me in my own playing to play more in tune, but to kind of practice better, to give myself more inquisitive mind when I was practicing, to say, oh, I'm running into a problem. I'm not just going to keep trying to overcome it, but I'm going to think a little bit more and try to discover what's causing this problem, what's behind it, and solve it that way. So, yeah. All right. So when I finished my doctorate in Kentucky, I was at another crossroads in my story, and I didn't quite know what to do. I think it was a striking thing for me, because in all of my schooling, I kind of thought, oh, you go to school for maybe as long as you can, and by the time you're done, it will be clear what your job for the rest of your life is going to be. And so I got to the end of my doctorate, and that was so totally not the case. And it was both maybe a little disappointing. I worked really hard at this school stuff, and all I have to show for it is a piece of paper. And I got a whole lot better at playing cello. I made some great friends and colleagues, and I'm so grateful for that. And also, what's next? Mm-hmm. So I decided to move back to Chicago. I moved back in with my parents, which I'm very also grateful for them for that support. I know that's not available to everybody. Um, but what it allowed me to do is remove some of the financial pressure of having to house myself and feed myself, and allowed me to do more seeking of where am I really going to find fulfillment with this craft that I've invested so much in. And so I was auditioning for orchestras all around the country, and I was expanding my teaching much more, and I was actively gigging in Chicago. And what I noticed was that the other musicians that I saw at my gigs were what seemed to me not so satisfied. They didn't seem to be so satisfied with the music making at the gigs or the repertoire, or what I interpreted as kind of their place in life. Some people might describe it as being a little jaded. And that was in contrast to my colleagues I was teaching then at the Music Institute of Chicago, these other Suzuki teachers who seemed really joyous in their work, and really inquisitive about how do I get better? How do I what can we do a little differently? What might this be like? Or I have a question that came up with one of my students. And I didn't see that so much in the other gigging musicians that I was interacting with. There was less a question of, oh, here we are at this gig. How are we going to make this the great best performance that we can on this particular weekend? It was much more of a job. We show up, we play the notes, we take the notes, we follow the conductor, whether we agree with them or not, and we go on. So that was clarifying for me, because I felt I liked doing both, but I was much more drawn to the kind of the company or the camaraderie of my fellow Suzuki teachers at the Music Institute of Chicago than I was it's also true that I saw them more regularly compared to the people who were gigging, and there was more of a relationship there. And I should also say that this is my experience and can be totally different for any other cellist. So these are just the reflections that kind of led me to where I am now. So that kind of insight of, I really like this camaraderie, the collegial feel of my colleagues who are teaching Suzuki, led me to maybe double down a little bit more on my teaching and come away a little bit more from my performing. It's also the case that in all my auditioning, I went once in a while to a second round, but didn't get an orchestra job. I think if I had gotten an orchestra job, my story would be different. I could have found the same thing in a steady orchestra position. I could have found something different. So I was thinking, okay, teaching feels a little bit more of my home. And of course, I've now been teaching for about 5 years from after I had graduated my undergrad. And along the way, I discovered that I consistently ran into a problem. I ran into this problem of wanting to share the physical elements of playing the cello that for me are one of the things I love most about it. It's like I'm dancing with someone who's also vibrating. Like, wow. But I kept getting stuck. In my own playing, I think that physical relationship with the instrument came from decades of studying it and practicing it. And I was a little bit at a loss, especially with my adult students, for how to share the simultaneous freedom and tone and intention in the body with the instrument. Is that making sense?
Yes.
And I had learned about a technique called the Alexander technique once from my dad, like a very long time ago. But then again, when I was in Boston, I had a class with Debbie Adams, where we applied this technique to playing music. So I was aware that there was a technique that helped people become aware of their body and release and find that balance of freedom and tone that allowed their expression to be freer. And so when I was like really thinking, yeah, teaching is something that's very dear to my heart and something I really want to invest more in, I reached out to a Alexander Technique teacher training program in Chicago, and applied, and there was space in the program, and so I enrolled, and it's a 3-year training that meets, I think, 4 days a week for 3 hours. So it's like a quite intensive kind of thing, kind of basically like going back to school. Luckily, I had lots of experience being in school and found that I enjoyed it and thrived kind of in that learning environment. So I was happy to go to school again. And it rooted me in Chicago for the next 3 years. And so I could continue to teach and to gig and expand my network there. And again, refine my teaching. That by this time, my teaching studio was, I don't remember exactly, somewhere between a dozen and 20 students. So I was doing it quite a lot at varying levels, from adults to 5-6-year-olds. And I was able to continue my private cello lessons with Tanya Carey to continue to advance my own playing. Plus, playing with other professional musicians in Chicago helped raise my expectations for myself. And the longer I was in the city, the more connections I was able to have, and so I got more fulfilling gigs with less jaded people who felt more happy to be playing music together, because playing music together is an amazing thing to be able to do. So that's, I think, where my personal seeking for how cello fits in as a profession kind of ended for me. And it's, we might say, the start of my love story. It was in those years when I was in my Alexander Technique program that I fell in love with the woman who's now my wife. And she used to be in academia, and so my career followed her for a little bit. And that's what ended up bringing us both to the East Coast. Now I live in Greenwich, Connecticut, where I am the director of Suzuki Strings at a public elementary school. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's talk about some of those things you mentioned in a little bit more detail. First, intonation. I mean, I do think that a lot of what you said has been exactly what I think a lot of people need to hear, the kind of the demystifying of it and destigmatizing of it. But there is a lot more to intonation. I mean, if we just want to say, all right, it's in tune when it sounds in tune, and then just walk away, we're missing a lot of the insider baseball of, under these circumstances, that's why we need the finger to be a little bit lower versus a little bit higher, rather than just thinking, it's like if we just move the finger without understanding it, I think in some ways it can be a missed opportunity, and the ear and the finger just don't trust each other as much as when we understand the why. So, I mean, I know a thesis, a dissertation is not necessarily easy to put into a nutshell, But can you give some of the highlights of what you found in your study of intonation on the cello?
Absolutely. And I think there's an important distinction, because this question of intonation, I think that you're raising is one of how do we know when something is in tune or not in tune, which is hugely important, right? And I chose to not answer that question. I think that there's some great resources, including a recent book by Hans Jensen called Practice Mind, and it's like amazing. I think that right, he's really got a deep insight into how we train ourselves to know what is in tune and what is not in tune.
Mm-hmm.
What I try to tackle is once we know, or as we're developing that knowledge, how do we apply it to the cello, right? I think it's one thing to say, well, I can identify if I'm in tune or not in tune, but I can't always do it, which I find a little more frustrating. It's like, well, I'm trying to play in tune. I'm not. So when we know what note we want to play or how we want our note to sound, how do we do that on a consistent basis? And so what I tried to do is I broke it down into 4 parts. One is what we do before we play the note. And a big part of that, right, is of course knowing the sound that how we want it to sound. And in my studies, right, the technical term for that is audiation. And so then the question is, okay, how do we refine our audiation? How do we refine what I like to call it, our musical imagination, our ability to hear, to imagine in sound? And can we just practice imagining in sound to improve that element, right? So then, okay, we will be developing that skill along the way. And of course, the more we practice, the better it gets. The more we even just think, oh, there's something, in order to consistently play in tune, I have to be doing something before I play the note. That already puts us one step further. Then there's the question, okay, how do I play the note? What's the angle of my finger going down on the string? How consistent am I in putting it down in the same angle? How loose is it so that I can adjust quickly, right? How much tension am I bringing in? Sometimes it's, right, how much tension am I bringing in the measure before? Not just in this part that's not in tune, but some larger portion of what am I actually doing physically to play the note that is either supporting my consistent, meeting my expectations of what I want to play, or hindering it. And then there's a question of, what do I do after the note? How am I listening to the sound in order to adjust? And how can I take the sound that I hear and compare it to the sound that I was hoping to produce in order to make sure that they're matching? And I find that, especially at the beginning of our study, that's a lot of attention to be both thinking of the sound that I want and feeling how it is to produce it, and to be listening and responding to what's actually produced. And so the final step is kind of putting it all together. How can we hold all of those things, and maybe even, well, because of course when we're performing, we have to do them all at the same time over and over again. And so do I have the attention bandwidth to be thinking about all of those things? I find, especially for my students who are just beginning to learn to read, that visual stimulus is so overwhelming on the attention that everything else is blocked out. And it's a really striking thing to see, because when they look away, they're listening and thinking and feeling, and then as soon as there's a piece of music in front of them, it's like they're a totally different cellist. And so that fourth piece is, okay, how do we balance all of these awarenesses and do them at the same time?
Okay, now you mentioned the segue between the intonation study coming from the vibrato book. Is that on the basis of the tendency of some cellists to use vibrato to hide intonation from themselves, or on the ability for vibrato to be a loosening agent that can be helpful?
For me, it was actually just in this kind of thinking about the structure of it. Because the little vibrato book was on this very small scale, like here's a concept, and here are a couple exercises that we can do to improve that concept. So for vibrato, the first concept is, okay, we have to be able to balance on our fingers. Before we can start moving, shaking, we have to find that balance. So here are some exercises we can do to just balance. And then I took that same kind of model into a much bigger topic of intonation, saying, okay, here's this concept, for example, of audiation. Here are a couple of exercises we can do just to improve our audiation.
Very nice. Very nice. Okay, now I gotta ask the cello story hour idea. I mean, there's actually, I guess it's kind of several questions, a number of things I'd like. First of all, I'd like for everybody watching this to go check that out. We'll include the link to them. But there are things that I like about it from the standpoint of the popularity of Peter and the Wolf, you know, how things like that can be such a wonderful introduction to the world of art music for people who kind of don't actively listen or don't understand what the attraction is of art music. That story is great. I love the creativity, particularly of the elephant upstairs. I also like the idea that there are things that you are doing in these stories that the first time some people try them, it might be one of those situations where you watch somebody do something, you watch somebody juggle and you go, okay, that they make it look easy, I can do that. And it's harder than it looks. The independence that it takes to keep the timing of your story going as kind of an independent, I mean, not a totally independent variable, but to not let it get in the way of the timing of your mechanics of your cello playing. But on the other hand, rather than trying to say that as a way to scare people off from trying it, I imagine that you can also speak to the benefits, how liberating it can be to kind of have the conscious brain let go of some of the technical aspects of playing the cello, to be able to focus more on the long trajectory of the story. So how do you come about anything that you want to say about those?
Well, I think that last point is really striking. When I think about the environment that I personally try to create in my performing, which, when I'm really doing it well, is this inclusive awareness, that it's not just me and my cello in this little world, and then the audience is over there and listening to me be in my little world playing my music. But it's really engaging. I'm trying to really play it for them. I should say that although I aspire to that, I don't get there very often. There was a really striking memory for me was when I was in Boston. I was giving a recital, and I got into that space. I was playing, I was aware of the audience, and then I made a little mistake, and I fell right out of it. But I remember that, I mean, it felt like, I don't know, a minute maybe. Probably it was a couple seconds. But I really distinctly remember that feel of ease with my playing, that I didn't have to think so much about how I was doing it, but I could think about a little bit more of the controlling of kind of the time, the experience for the audience. And I think in storytelling, that's really it's a much more easy way for me to access it. Maybe because I don't know if you could tell already, I like talking a little bit. So maybe because of that ease, or because it's reading out loud is something I also enjoy, just because I think it's fun. So controlling that time between between sentences and words comes a little bit more naturally for me, whereas in my cello playing, I am still working to overcome the, oh, yeah, well, here's this note, then this note here, and here's my pulse, and it takes one more step for me to go beyond that technique and rigidity to feel all of that in the background, to create on top of that technical foundation and metric structure. So.
And do you use a lot of storytelling then in your teaching with your students to try and help them not only get a natural musicality, but to let go of some of that tendency to micromanage?
Yes and no.
Okay.
I think most of my students, especially now, are young. At my public school, I'm teaching 3 to 8-year-olds. My private studio is maybe like 8 to 12. And so stories I use often to just help them remember things. Either whether it's like making a little story about a song so that they can remember the structure of it, or a little story to help them access the character that we're going for a little more. But it's because I'm working with with more beginner students, the stories are often more in service of learning the technique so that they can do it, rather than helping them get the one step further. They know the technique and they're going beyond to use it to create something.
Very nice. All right. Well, you are clearly a very inspirational teacher. The testimonials, for example, on your website, and I can only imagine not only the reception by the kids of these stories, these cello stories, and you probably, I don't know if you even know how many youngsters you have inspired to take up the cello
because of that.
Them seeing you and going, oh my gosh, I totally want to do that. But in those situations when you find a student needs a little bit of extra help in the realm of motivation to practice, what are some of your favorite ideas for helping them?
So I think it's a great question. And just like a lot of my teaching, it's one I have for my students and also for myself. How do I motivate myself to sit down and practice? And right, if it's hard for me, who I've gotten years of knowledge that I know I really love playing the cello, of course it's going to be hard for my students who don't necessarily have all of that same experience. What I find one of the biggest drawbacks or the obstacles for motivation is a feeling of either not being good enough, not being able to do it. This sense that we start with I'm already like maybe behind. I need to practice to get better. I think that's the often what we say. But I think that underneath that message, for some students, including myself, is the idea of I have to practice because I'm not good enough yet, which is a pretty negative message. And so what I try to do for my students and for myself is I try to shift that so that practicing isn't necessarily about becoming better, although that's a happy byproduct. It's about spending time on your cello or instrument. It's about the playground, about finding joy in it. So sometimes, especially with adult students, I kind of invite them to sit down and just to do something.
Yeah.
Right. The first thing that you need to do, you see, when you sit down to practice, you don't have to be productive right away. There's an opportunity to explore, experiment, to play a favorite piece, to make a funny sound. But something that enters this time with the cello in a joyous, celebratory way, not I gotta learn something now. I think that the learning is almost a byproduct. I'd say the other element of it is is how we relate to mistakes. And this is something I see especially in my public school teaching, where I get to see a whole lot more students. So that the like frequency of this, the challenge of making a mistake comes up so much more often. And of course, when we practice, of course, when we play music, we're going to make mistakes. That is an inherent part of our art and our craft. And if we can't if we can't handle that, we have to shift our relationship to mistakes. And so when I think about practicing, and what I try to encourage my students in their practicing is not to bemoan the mistakes. We're not trying to practice to avoid mistakes. We're trying to practice to find our mistakes. If we find a mistakes, that's like we have achieved our goal. We are being successful. There's something we're dissatisfied with, that is great. Right? Because it means that your internal, this idea of what you do before you play the note, your internal idea of what you want yourself as a musician is already ahead of where you are. And like, you've already taught yourself that there's something beyond to aspire to. And that's great, right? You can already celebrate, hey, I'm asking myself to do something I don't know how to do yet. Like, all right. And you've identified something to improve, right? You've already done two successful things. When you discover a mistake, you're already like 2 steps in. And so if we can kind of celebrate that more, to be like, okay, I found a mistake. Is this a mistake I want to work on today? Oh, maybe it is, maybe it's not. Maybe this is the mistake that I've been seeing all week, but I'm just gonna I don't know, maybe we'll have a list of the mistakes. I'll get to that next week or whatever it is. It's not the mistake my teacher told me to work on, so that's fine too. But if we can change our relationship to mistakes, I think that helps a lot with motivation. And it helps us improve faster as well.
Very nice, very nice. I like that, the attitude of kind of practice being its own joy and its own reward. This sort of approach, I think, is definitely going to help be insurance against the possibility of becoming jaded. Well, tremendous. So what things do you have going on in 2024? Performances and projects?
It's so there's one other element in what my life as a performing musician, which is that it's how do I say this? Well, I want to return again to this moment in my life as a new father. And it raises a question because in my schooling and in my bachelorhood of being a professional musician, it was very much my whole life, right? I was practice in the morning and then go teach and then have a gig and then go to sleep and I'd be doing it again, which if you love playing music, which I love music, it was a great way to live my life. And now there are other things that I also love to have in my life, right? I love to have my family in my life. I love to have friends and other like non-musical hobbies, and that's important too. So where I am now, what I have for this year is a continued search for this balance of continuing to practice, continuing to explore some creative projects, which I'll mention in a moment, but also to really think about this balance between my family, maybe my personal life, and my musical life, and my professional life, and making sure that I'm fulfilled and have that balance. Of course, it's going to shift. I don't know. It'll shift in a couple months. It'll shift next year. I don't know. But keeping that as a question, that yes, I'm a musician. Yes, I'm a cellist and a teacher, and I'm also a father and a husband and a player of games and a tennis player. All these, right? All of the elements that make me Danny. And I want to make sure that whatever pressure, because I still have an internalized idea of I should be practicing, or I should be X, Y, or Z, making sure that I don't let one element of those life take over too much. Or if it does in one moment, then it comes back to balance for something else. So that being said, I know that in my life as a professional, I mean, now I'm teaching full time, and I'm living in a new place. I've been here in Connecticut for only about a year and a half.
Okay.
So I'm still finding my way as a performer and creating the network and opportunities for me to get to express myself on a high level, not just playing along with my students. Mm-hmm. And so I'm looking for more of those opportunities to do some gigging, to find a regional orchestra to play with, and looking for, when I'm walking around town, I'm kind of in the back of my head is always this question of like, oh, would this be a nice place for a concert? Oh, wow, look at this space. Or, I wonder if they could use a concert here. So I'm also trying to put together a program of solo music so that I can go out into my community and play. So those are maybe the most traditional paths that I have trying to get myself going in 2024 to do that. I also have a project that's been brewing for a couple of years of recording natural sounds. I'm especially drawn to like brooks and streams. So making audio and sometimes some visual, like a video recording of that, and then improvising cello to accompany that natural sound. So I'm trying to get a collection of pieces, probably like 3 to 5 minutes of duets for cello and nature. So that's right. Again, we talked about, or I mentioned how I'm trying to expand what it means to be a performing musician. Where can the cello fit in as a voice, musical voice? And so that's one of my, more creative projects that I have. Hopefully I'll make take some more ground on that in 2024.
Yeah. Wow. I love that. I love that creativity. We all know creativity is an important component of any of the arts, the performing arts included, but finding a way for it to manifest that is going to also resonate with audiences is easier said than done. But I mean, I think your instincts for how and when and in what way to apply them are wonderful and are going to lead you in all sorts of great directions. More power to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Well, it's been a great joy talking with you. And for those of you about to get your instruments out and practice all weekend long, good luck with that. And we'll see you back here next Friday. Take care.
All right. Take care.
You had me at